So what I
Thanks,
was really
Kate.
hoping to highlight, though, is the different way we'd give those same instructions to the king compared to the dog, because with the
Yes,
king, there's more obligation to be polite and respectful. So
yes.
what you'll notice, though, is both differences in grammar and differences in tone when you're being polite in English. One of the things that you'll do when speaking to the dog, as I said, very short, abrupt commands with a falling tone, whereas with the king, your voice becomes higher and more flowing. Excuse me, Your Majesty, if it wouldn't trouble you too much, could you possibly refrain from sampling those refreshments? Notice you start to use refreshments instead of food and beverage instead of drink, so you're changing the words that you use to make them more formal, and also that your grammar becomes a lot more fancy. This is how we show we're being polite. Talking to the dog, very direct, issuing commands. The king, you're phrasing it as a question, you're using a lot of fancy grammar and higher level words and so on. And we're offering him a choice. We don't want him to think that we're imposing on him. So to decode how politeness works in English, we tend to insert all these extra polite words that we wouldn't usually use with their dogs, unless you're as polite to them as Nola is. Provide an explanation. We explain that the speaker's about to start to kind of give some context. High flowing intonation rather than sit becomes a different way of speaking to people, and you tend to use much more fancy grammar. And this is the most difficult part for a non-native English speaker. I was wondering if you could possibly is grammatically very, very tricky. I was, the verb to be in past imperfect first person form, followed by wondering, present participle, if you could possibly, and we haven't even got to the point yet. So there are a couple of things.
Would you like to say that again, please, and explain what it is?
I'm just saying that I was wondering if you could possibly is actually a grammatically very tricky sentence. It's a very complicated grammar.
Yep.
And for a native English speaker, you don't need to think about it. So much so that as a native English speaker, Nola, I explained the grammar that you just use naturally, and you're sort of a bit, what? Sorry? What was all that about? Because most people don't study grammar, even if they're native English speakers. But if you're trying to piece that together from what you learned in the classroom, it's very tricky.
Yes.
All right, other things we tend to do when we're being formal, we start using passive voice. Toastmasters members are required to complete 2 levels of, that sort of thing. We talk about policy, and we sort of, could I make a suggestion? So we phrase it as a question rather than as a statement. So what we see there is that because of this difficult grammar and all these extra rules about how your voice should sound and how to approach something, what you'll see is that when you're a native English speaker, the politer you're trying to be, often the harder you get to understand. And when you're talking to a native English speaker, they will often come across a bit abrupt. Why? Because the fancy stuff is difficult. It's quite easy to say, oh yes, please sit down. No, you must give me this. Because that's very direct, simple grammar. And to be polite requires a very high level of grammar, which a lot of non-native English speakers don't have. So what you'll see is because of the difficulties with grammar, non-native English speakers can come across as impolite or pushy when they have no intention of doing so whatsoever.